Hi, John. Hi, Simon. Hi, Josh. Hi, Jeff. How are you all doing? Good?
Great, thank you.
Thank you for joining us and taking your time to be on our panel today. We really appreciate it, and I'm really excited to hear some of the things that you guys have to share with us. So before we get started on this panel discussion, I just want to give a bit of information to the audience. So thank you to everybody that's watching. I'm sure there's a few more people to log in, but we'll just get started. This is going to be our final webinar for a while now. So our final webinar in this webinar series. So I wanted to say a huge thanks to everybody who's watched a webinar over the last few months, left a question, left a comment, emailed us afterwards, just supported us in our webinars. We've been really overwhelmed by all of your support, and we're really grateful for you guys, and that's why we've kept this webinar series going. So thank you so much. As always, you can find our previous webinars on our website at mantatrust.org/webinars, and you can also find out more information about mantas and mobile arrays and how to support us as well. Okay, so as for the technical information for this webinar, if you haven't watched one of these before, as audience members, your audio and video is automatically switched off, so don't worry about disturbing the webinar in any way. You can make your breakfast or your dinner whilst watching. And we would love to hear from you, however, even though we can't hear you. So please put any questions or comments in the Q&A box, which is on the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we will either ask these questions throughout the webinar or at the end in a special questions section. Any comments can go in there as well. If you have a question for somebody in particular, then please put their name in the question so we know who to ask. This discussion is going to last a maximum of 90 minutes. So we're going to have a discussion and then we'll have time for questions at the end. We may launch a couple of polls as well, where we're going to ask you about your experiences. So if you want to answer, please do. If not, you can just close it down and ignore it. And we'll share some of the results and sort of chat about them in the discussion as well. Okay, so the theme for today is charismatic species and conservation. So I think this is a really good theme to end our series on. Mantas are obviously a very charismatic species. They're very well loved, they're very beautiful, curious. I could go on, but we wanted to talk about the benefits of conserving mantas and the broader ecological benefits of conserving charismatic species like mantas, rhinos, polar bears, whale sharks, whales, tigers, elephants. So we convened this panel of these incredible experts in all of these species. And I'm really excited to hear a bit more, not just about mantas, but about this very diverse and somewhat random mix of animals. I think we're all going to learn a lot today. So today we have Dr. Josh Stewart of the Manta Trust and the NOAA Cetacean Health and Life History Program, Dr. Simon Pierce of the Marine Megafauna Foundation and the IUCN Shark Specialist Group. I think there's a longer title there, co-chair of the African region or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, that'll do to be getting on with, though.
And then we have John Taylor of Save the Rhino International and Jeff York of Polar Bears International. So a really good mix of panelists. So I'm going to stop talking now and ask these panelists to tell us a bit more about themselves, their backgrounds, and if you could please tell us a bit more about the species that you work with as well, and the sort of conservation status of the animal that you work with, or the animals that you work with. John, you are first on my screen, so if you would like to go first.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm John Taylor. I'm Deputy Director of Save the Rhino International, which is a wonderful job to have. In previous lives, I have been out surveying whales and dolphins in the North Atlantic. I have worked with ZSL looking after tigers and Asian elephants. I spent a long time at WWF looking after climate change, trying to look after climate change. I have lived in Africa and Asia for several years, and I've worked on a lot of European species as well. So general purpose conservationist is my background. The species I get to work with now is wonderful if we're making a pitch for our favorite species. Conservation species, there are 5 species of rhinos for people who are not familiar with rhinos. 2 of them live in Africa. There's the white rhinos that you can see probably behind me, that are now mostly down in southern Africa, although not all. Their conservation, they're the most numerous type of rhino now. They were thought to be extinct 100 years ago due to massive hunting. There was about 50, maybe 100 found in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and they're now at about 18,000. That's the majority of rhinos in the world. When I was a kid many, many years ago, there were 65,000 black rhinos in Africa. 20 years ago, there were 2,000. It's now back up to about 5.5. In Asia, the Indian rhinos are at about 3,500 and holding steady, but running out of habitat. And in Indonesia, where we have the Sumatran and Javan rhinos, they are swiftly running out of habitat. All the Javan rhinos are in one place, and there's 72 of them. The Sumatran rhinos, there's less than 80, but that's about as much as we know. And they're scattered throughout fragments of rainforests. So we're trying to bring them together into a safe place so that they can meet each other and make baby rhinos. But we don't know how many are out there, not nearly enough. They're wonderful animals. They're big and they've got a big horn on their nose. And that's both a blessing and a curse, as we will discuss, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you so much. So much interesting experience there. Simon, you're next up on my screen.
Thanks, Flossie. Thanks very much for having me. So yeah, my name's Simon. I'm kind of a bit of a monomaniac in terms of research terms comparatively, I think. So I've been working mostly on whale sharks for about 15 years now. I'm a principal scientist at the Marine Megafauna Foundation. So we focus on research and conservation education on some of these large charismatic marine animals. So this is a good talk for me to participate in and learn from too. So whale sharks are the largest fish in the world. They get up to about 20 meters long. Before Josh gets in with it, they've also got one of the smallest brains of the relative to body size probably. So I think of them as kind of lovable himbos, which I hear is a thing now. So I'm working with it. They're kind of like ocean Labradors, I think. So they're pretty highly food motivated. They are a very charismatic species because they're so big for one thing. They're really nice white spotted and striped animals, and they've been very popular in tourism around the world. So there's well over $100 million worth of tourism going on, a lot of that going into the developing world, which is also funding some conservation measures and things that are associated with them and some of the habitats they live in. So yeah, most of my work revolves around whale sharks. I'm actually, I do a bit of work as a wildlife photographer as well. I'm very keen on rhinos. The black rhino is my kind of unicorn. I've never managed to see one. I've actually spent the last couple of summers going up to Svalbard to try and find some polar bears as well. And I'm also aware of manta rays. So yeah. So yeah, thanks very much.
I think you're more than just aware of manta rays. That's awesome that you're so connected to those other animals as well. Going to make for an interesting discussion. All right, Jeff, you're up next. Please.
Okay, my name is Jeff York. I'm the Senior Director of Conservation at Polar Bears International. We're a single species focused group just working on polar bears specifically. I've been fortunate enough to work just on one species for 20 years as of this year, including about 16 years of getting out on the ice and handling and capturing bears out where they live. So pretty lucky in that respect. Polar bears are circumarctic. It's the only part of the world they live in. Their primary conservation threat is definitely climate change and subsequent loss of sea ice habitat. There makes it a extraordinarily challenging species to work on, as does the geography, as does the number of large geopolitical players that are polar bear range countries. So it's been an adventure, to say the least.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. And Josh, last but not least, you can fight for the mantas versus the whale sharks.
Oh yeah, well, we'll see what we can do, Simon. Yeah, so I'm Josh. I've been an associate director of the Manta Trust since it was formed, and I've been working with Manta and devil rays for about 10 years now, and they're sort of one of my primary groups of species that I work with. In terms of threats, I'd say that Manta and devil rays sort of became famous about 8 or 10 years ago because of the gill plate trade, and there's a lot of media attention about them being targeted for their gill plates and those being used in traditional Chinese medicine, which I'm sure John is very familiar with those same issues. And there have been a lot of really great international management and conservation measures that have been enacted since then. And I wouldn't say that we're done with targeted fisheries and that they're no longer a threat or a risk or a problem for Manta and devil rays. But these days we're starting to recognize that bycatch and incidental capture of Manta and devil rays is probably equally problematic, or possibly even more problematic for their populations than these targeted fisheries. So there's been certainly a big pivot in the research and conservation community to try and address those bycatch impacts in addition to preventing targeted fisheries and sort of illegal international trade. We still, despite 10 years of pretty targeted research effort and a good deal of funding for Manta and devil rays, there's still a huge number of questions about basic life history, ecology, biology. And because of that, we can't really say with confidence how populations are doing in too many places. I'd say it depends on the species, depends on the location, and how developed the fisheries are in different regions. But there's a lot of variability across the world and between species in terms of population status. Some are doing probably quite well, and some have been almost wiped out with local extirpations or local extinctions. So that's sort of my work with mantas and devil rays. And then for the last 2 years, I've been a research scientist with the National Marine Fisheries Service here in the US. And I've been working mainly on 2 species of whales. Southern resident killer whales, which are in the Northeast Pacific, very endangered population of killer whales that get a lot of news attention and media attention, and gray whales, which are actually doing quite well. They're probably one of the model species for how whales can recover post-whaling. And it's been really interesting seeing how different the level of attention for whales is compared to manta rays, and also how different the sort of type of research effort and where the funding for research and conservation comes from. Because in the US, we have a Marine Mammal Protection Act, which leads to very robust protections for marine mammals, including whales, and lots of research funding. And it's been very interesting to see how probably the budget for gray whale research annually in the US exceeds, I would say, all manta and devil ray research funding globally every year. So that's been a really interesting contrast, and I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about those differences today.
Okay, thank you. That is super interesting, especially in the context of this conversation as well. So I think, Simon, you kind of touched on this already, but I wanted to ask you all about the animals that you work with and why you think they're considered charismatic, and what made you fall in love with these species. Why are they special to you? So maybe, Simon, you can go first. I know you touched on it a little bit already.
Sure. So yeah, with whale sharks, it was a really interesting one for me, particularly because I was actively not interested in charismatic species going into this. So I've grown up in New Zealand, where I am at the moment, and we've got all sorts of threatened species issues over here, mostly due to habitat destruction, but especially introduced predators. So there's been some really interesting and quite groundbreaking conservation work done on some of the birds, especially here, because there was no choice. Like, it was either do really interventionist sort of management or definitely lose them. So reading the stories about that kind of stuff really inspired me, and I wanted to get into conservation to help with those efforts, and then science was kind of the tool I wanted to use to do it. But I was always drawn towards these like some of the smaller stuff that was really getting no attention. So I ended up doing a PhD that focused mostly on small stingrays, and so little was known about them that even just around in Queensland in Australia, where I ended up doing the PhD, we were still discovering new species there, and it's a bay with like 2 million people living around it. And then I was really interested in these species that just no one knew about, because I knew we could have a real impact in their conservation as kind of a small group. And then everything kind of changed with one of my friends that was also doing a project on rays, Andrea, that's also in the Marine Megafauna Foundation. She moved over to Mozambique to start a PhD on manta rays. And she was seeing a lot of whale sharks, and she was like, look, I'd love it if you came over and had a look at them as well. And I was like, lame. Like, I'm sure there's loads known about whale sharks, you know, like I'd seen plenty of them in documentaries and things, which is of course where a lot of people get introduced to stuff in like kids' books and things. There was plenty of photos out there. And I was like, I'm sure there's tons of people working on whale sharks, so I'm not interested. And then she was like, I'll just, you know, it'd still be fun to work together. And I had a look into it, and just to kind of humor her, I started trying to learn about what was known about whale sharks at the time. And when I looked into it, I was like, oh, geez, there's nothing. Like, there's hardly anything about their life history. Nothing's known about populations. What is known is that they've been severely hit by fisheries, and there were still some pretty major commercial fisheries going on for them at the time. So I was kind of like, yeah, okay, like whale sharks could be cool. So I went over to Mozambique, where she was working, to check it out. And it was pretty funny when I arrived. She was kind of like, okay, so I've kind of told everyone here that you're like a big whale shark expert. And this is me never having seen one before in my life. And I was just like, okay. And she was like, so when you do see one, try and be cool. Because we're right. But then the thing is, you jump in the water with these things, and they're big and they're gentle, and there's no other animal, I don't think, in the world that you can be like as close to and interact with a whale in the way you can with a whale shark in perfect safety. Like, anyone that can float around with a life jacket on can safely swim with whale sharks and stuff. And it changes people's lives. And certainly it changed my life as well. Like, just going in there and go, okay, like, I really like these animals, and they really need help. So I was like, okay, yeah, I can kind of work with this. And so in terms of general stuff, I mean, I think a lot of it is they are a really iconic species just by virtue of their size. Like, they are sort of almost twice as big as the next largest fish in terms of mass and length anyway. And one of the things that they've really got going for them is that it's very easy to do public relations for whale sharks. Like, they're not dangerous. You can swim with them. They're very popular tourism species, and they're quite pretty. So they don't really bother anyone, but they benefit quite a few people. So that's really been something that's in their favor.
Okay, thank you. And I think we'll definitely come back to that later, but that's a really cool story. And it's funny to think where you could be now if you'd refused that trip.
Studying lizards.
Yeah. All right, what about you, John? Tell us more about your love for rhinos.
Oh, I was a classic case. I was, by 3 or 4 years old, I was little Johnny who loved animals. And, you know, like any 3 or 4 year old, it's all the big ones that you can identify. So we have supporters who are just crazy about rhinos. There is something about rhinos, and it's not other animals. But for me, it's the whole gang. You know, I knew an awful lot of species by the age of 7 or 8, and then I found out what the word endangered meant one day, and that was that. Career was sealed. But so for me, it's, you know, I've never seen a whale shark, and I've been looking. but it's the whole gang. It's the whales and the whale sharks and the manta rays and the ellies and the tigers and the lions and the rhinos. So it's that fantastic natural world. And I think as a conversation about charismatic animals, that's a sort of classic route in, because these are the guys that people grow up learning about. And we see images of lions several times a day, or rhinos or ellies. almost giving an illusion that they're still abundant, which of course in many, many cases they're not. My friends with the horns on their nose are just lovely. They are, I mean, they're the modern Triceratops. And that's, I think, why people, there's such, the word iconic is overused, but they are absolutely iconic animals, whether it's the African plains or the Asian jungles. There's a rhino, and it's unmistakable. The lovely thing about them is there's, you know, companies name themselves after rhinos because they're big and they're powerful and they're strong and all of these things. And as soon as you get to meet them, and if you meet a rhino and it's been around people enough to know that people are not a threat, so it hasn't got that instant charge response, they're lovely. They're really gentle animals. You see them with their calves and they're beautiful, and they really like having their tummy rubbed, which is just, they are absolutely charming animals, as well as being absolutely magnificent. So yeah, I've only been working on rhinos for a couple of years, but I'm in love.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to tickle a rhino's tummy. It's a funny phrase I didn't think I'd be saying tonight. All right, what about you, Jeff? I mean, polar bears are quite extreme to find your way into. So what made you fall in love with them?
More like Simon, I think I came in through a very circuitous backdoor path. So I wasn't interested in charismatic species at all either, and wasn't even kind of aware of being a biologist as a career opportunity, that was a thing you could do and be paid for and make a lifetime, you know, devotation out of it. So I think for me, the whole experience has been this evolving cascade of interesting opportunities and the ability to just pursue some of those. So my first job out of U was working at a fisheries project in the Arctic. And the Arctic is something that just keeps coming back throughout that circuitous path. They keep getting tossed back into the north. And so I proposed doing a research project on Arctic capelin at the time, and a very important forage fish for a host of species, and no one cared. No one cared to fund it. No one was that interested. People kind of shrugged their shoulders. So I went on into some freshwater ecology studies. After, you know, finishing up graduate school, going back into the work world, I ended up back in the north, back with marine mammals and working with mostly native Alaskans, kind of cruising around the state of Alaska, mostly coastal Alaska, and taking really good tissue samples from a variety of marine mammals they were taking for food. And just by chance, that entire project fell under the direction of the lead in the US for polar bear research. And 20 years ago, this fall, he asked me if I wanted to go out and tag bears 1 year, and I said yes, and have never looked back. And so at this point, for me, you know, once you go out, and similar but different from whale sharks, because polar bears are amazing and beautiful and soft and smell fantastic when they're asleep and anesthetized. You're not going to go swim with them otherwise. But being that close to bears over the years, getting to see them out in their habitat, which is stunning. You think nothing could possibly live out here, could survive out here in this icy, cold world. And then you see these large bears cruising around on the ice. It's absolutely stunning. And so after, you know, years of working with them from a research standpoint, I really began to feel I owed them something back, more than just the science. And so that led me to a career on the conservation side of trying to bring science to policy, science to the public. And to me, it's very much kind of giving back that polar bears have given me these amazing opportunities and this fantastic career, and I definitely owe them in response. But that's my short story.
Thank you. That's very heartwarming and inspiring. And now I also want to smell a polar bear. All right, and Josh.
I'm reluctant to tell this story, Simon. So after college, I had this really great scholarship for a year, which paid for me to go do a series of internships all over the world. And I actually really wanted to go do an internship studying whale sharks for reasons that are mysterious to me to this day, in the Maldives. And I contacted the people who ran it and that project, and they said, oh, this time of year we're just really not doing any work because the whale sharks aren't around. And there's this other guy who works on manta rays, and maybe we could set you up with him if you're interested. And I said, oh geez, well, I guess I'll take it as a consolation prize. Not really my first choice, but I'll check him out. Maybe it could be. And he said, oh, sometimes they see whale sharks. And I said, well, okay, if there's a chance that maybe I'll see a whale shark while I'm working with these mantas, then maybe it'll be worth it. So then, I spent a month in the Maldives working with the Maldivian Manta Ray Project, which was the precursor to the Manta Trust. And what was so amazing about these animals is that, unlike whale sharks, they're incredibly smart. They have these enormous brains. They're super interactive. I agree, Simon, whale sharks have size, which is dramatic. However, they're sort of like big tadpoles, which nothing wrong with that, but they're not so interested in you while you're swimming next to them. In contrast, you get in the water with a manta and all they want to do is come check you out. You can tell they're looking at you. They're truly interacting. You can really feel that intelligence behind that eye. And so, I was just absolutely in love with the animal at that time. And I started asking these people who had been working with mantas, like Guy Stevens, just basic questions, the stuff that you learn in elementary school about elephants and rhinos and polar bears and things like that. And the answer was almost universally, oh, we don't really know. Nobody's studied that. Almost to, everything, the most basic questions you could ask. And so that was really sort of interesting and exciting at that time in my career, thinking, wow, well, there are a lot of opportunities to get involved and do some sort of interesting foundational research with these animals. And that was also right around the time that the gill plate trade was becoming better known and more publicized. And so there was this sort of trifecta of beautiful, amazing, charismatic animals that are just a dream to spend time with, a really clear conservation threat. And then similar to what Simon was describing with whale sharks, just huge knowledge gaps, despite them being this really impressive, charismatic species that the public is in love with. And that was a huge surprise, and also a really obvious opportunity to sort of get involved. And so, I think similar to Simon, that was sort of too good to pass up, and led to me working with them, doing my PhD on them, and now having worked with them for about 10 years. And then in contrast, the whales, I think in first grade, I had whale time with my teacher or something and just fell in love. It's every kid's story, At first you learn about whales and rhinos and elephants and things like that. But it becomes really obvious as you're going through school, if you're studying marine biology, that you don't then become a marine biologist and study whales. There are a couple of people who do that, a small handful of people, but everybody wants to go play with dolphins and things like that. You're probably not going to do it. And so I had sort of given up on ever really trying to work with whales. Also because there's so much attention, so much research attention and focus on whales. And so, I sort of diverted and went off and have really enjoyed working on manta rays. And then through the sort of quantitative modeling work that I've been doing, it was really easy to just transition to whales. So I kind of came in through the back door and have since been working with whales. But, whale people are a very specific type of researcher. I don't like to put myself in that group. I'm a general marine ecologist, definitely not a whale person.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I love all of these stories. They're very inspiring. It's nice to hear about the sort of backgrounds to you all. Okay, so we'll move on to our first sort of big question. There's so many elements to this question, but I'm just going to ask it in a basic way. What are the pros of conserving these charismatic species? Sort of instead of focusing on huge areas or smaller species, are there benefits to focusing on these single species management and conservation? Perhaps, John, you can talk to us first.
Just getting my thoughts in order. Yes, I think that there are definite advantages, and I think there are two key ones. One of them is the discussion around umbrella species, around flagship species. Particularly if you're dealing with animals that cover a large range, whether that's in water or on land, then looking after that species obviously involves looking after the habitat in which they live. And if that habitat is home to a large number of other species, some of which may be the smaller ones that people don't know about so much, but of course are equally important, then focusing on that species just acts as a metaphor in a way for the entire habitat. And yes, you can be looking after manta territory, or you can be looking after black rhino territory. But if you're looking after black rhinos, you're also looking after lions and aardvarks and dung beetles and tapirs and whatever else lives out there. So I think from that angle, from the sort of scientific umbrella indicator, flagship species argument, there's definitely a connection. But the connection is with the public. And the connection is as the conversation, partly for fundraising, which is so important in conservation, but also for articulating what we're doing as conservationists. It captures the public imagination, and you can talk to people about rhinos or whale sharks or polar bears in a way that if you were focusing on some of the edge species, these species that are very important because they're evolutionarily distinct, they don't have any close relatives, and they're globally endangered, but these are things like selenodons and sawfish and hairy-nosed wombats. They are not the kind of things that people, as you say in first grade, you hear about, the whales and the rhinos and the tigers. So having that conversation is much more difficult. So I think that's the importance of them, the pro as charismatic species. You can talk to people about them and they embrace a whole lot of other species as well.
Okay, thank you. Josh, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think John's spot on. I'll just give a couple examples, and thinking about mantas specifically. Mantas, divers get to see mantas, they interact with them. They're certainly the flagship of these species that we focus on. Very rarely do people get to go diving with devil rays. They're way more skittish. You know, if you get to actually interact with the devil ray in the water, you count yourself lucky if you're one of these people, because such a rare occurrence. And I think that because of that, if 10 years ago, all of the focus had been on devil ray gill plates and maybe mantas hadn't been targeted, or, you know, mantas didn't exist or something like that, I think we'd have a really different response. I think that things would have gone really differently. And so mantas certainly have acted as this sort of umbrella species for the whole mobulid group, which have really helped advance conservation efforts for manta and devil rays jointly. And then just thinking about, you know, generally the pros of working with a charismatic species, there are so many species out there that require pretty acute conservation attention. And I don't think that charismatic species are necessarily more deserving than others, but there are limited funds out there available, and it's easier to get the public motivated, to get donors, foundations, et cetera, interested in providing funds to help with research and conservation projects for these species. So in some ways, it's the low-hanging fruit. You know, if there are limited funds out there, you have to grab what you can in order to work on these, you know, very active conservation measures. And it's easier to do that with these charismatic species. And I think that that's in some ways unfortunate for the less charismatic species, because they often get left in the dust unless they somehow come under the umbrella of these more charismatic flagship species.
Okay, thank you. And often, from what I've witnessed in the Maldives at least, you can use these charismatic species like mantas. We get mantas protected in Haniforo Bay and in other areas, and then it protects that whole area, and you see sort of high populations of fish and other species in that area as well. So I wanted to ask you, Simon, if you've you've had this experience with marine protected areas and how whale sharks or other animals have helped you to get whole areas sort of conserved better.
Yeah, well, there's been, I agree with all of the points that have been raised so far. And there's, with whale sharks specifically, yeah, in terms of marine protected areas, I mean, there's, like say Ningaloo Reef, World Heritage Area in Western Australia, was part of the rationale for naming that a World Heritage Area was the presence of whale sharks. And explicitly, and other places like there's, yeah, the presence of these charismatic species, it does give you a huge advantage in getting protected areas declared. For better or worse, I think there's so much of, like, conservation is about people. And like Josh says, I mean, the first step is getting people to care. And if people like intrinsically like these species, you are so much further down the track rather than having to work on kind of like a kind of brand awareness of an animal. And I mean, people are getting pretty clever about how they accomplish that to make them into charismatic species by giving them like awesome names like the ninja lantern shark and things. But like these big animals, they just, like, people are aware of them, and that helps them, that helps us to be able to leverage them as these kind of umbrella species. It's a really interesting one for me. You see, like, no one really, people do ask, like, what people often ask me, what would happen if there were no whale sharks and things, which is complicated because ecological webs are complicated. But like over here in New Zealand, for instance, and I think we're a pretty pro-conservation country and an environmentally aware country. But like, say there'll be a development project and there'll be a unique species of snail or something that's only found in this area of land that they want to clear or something. And there will definitely be I'm one for kind of intrinsic value of all species, and they all have a right to exist, unsurprisingly. but I mean, people do ask, it's like, well, you know, I mean, it's just a little snail. Like, is that going to affect us? And like, because people often feel a lot more closely connected to some of these species that are considered charismatic for various factors and things, and they have read about them at school, and they have done school projects on them, and they've watched documentaries of them and things. It's just, you're compare, like Josh said, like low-hanging fruit, you're kind of pushing against an open door. So they're a great way to start a conversation about protecting the habitats that benefit them, but then of course, as John said, you're protecting that whole ecosystem that comes along with it.
Okay, cool, thank you. I'm on the snail side too. All right, Jeff, what are sort of the benefits of protecting polar bears? Are there wider benefits for the Arctic ecosystems?
Absolutely. This is, I guess, one of the pros on the polar bear file, but also a con. Because our primary threat is global climate change and loss of sea ice, if we're successful in conserving polar bears, we're of course successful then in helping to conserve all ice-dependent species, including ice-dependent people who live in the Arctic. But beyond that, we're also helping all of us. That means internationally, we've addressed this significant threat that has follow-on impacts to all the species we're talking about and to all of us. So it really has very direct impacts. You know, as people are experiencing severe climate change impacts in sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, in the Middle East, we have a large charismatic species in the Arctic, a place that's warming faster than anywhere in the world. That's another story. It's another piece of that same puzzle on the wildlife side. So yeah, I see very clear conservation impacts if we can be successful in conserving them.
Okay, thank you. And then you mentioned before that you spent a long time working with native people from the Arctic, is that right? Yeah, so I wanted to ask, because I read an interesting article that said it's easier to make an animal charismatic or appealing to protect if traditionally the people living in that country worship or sort of have traditional symbolism with this animal. Do you find that the people are on board with protecting the polar bear that are from the Arctic? Sorry, I haven't phrased that in the best way, but hopefully you get what I mean.
Absolutely. And in general, and this is, I've also been fortunate to work around the Arctic in all range countries and a fair bit recently in Russia. I would say people who live in polar bear habitat generally and genuinely do care deeply about the wildlife and nature around them, because they, in most cases, rely more closely on that nature for their survival, for their success there. So they do have this direct connection. But I will say, and I think this is true globally with a lot of charismatic species, it's quite one thing to say from your couch in Montana, save the polar bears. It's quite another thing to live with polar bears or rhinos or elephants. You know, these are animals that do hurt and kill people and damage property. So I think we as biologists and conservationists just always have to keep that front of mind as when we're talking about increasing populations, when we're talking about conserving these large species, we're also asking people to live next to them, to live with them to some extent. And we have to make sure we're addressing both of those things concurrently.
And I'm going to come back to John on that point, because I've read a bit about a lot of sort of African animals that in the Western world we love, we portray as charismatic, but in local communities in Africa, perhaps they are nuisances or they're not as well loved. So have you found that this has impacted your work in a positive or negative way, John?
That's an incredibly complicated question. I think the first thing I would say is I wouldn't go anywhere near generalizing cultures. And we've got to be very careful of that, because people do it all the time, of course. You know, most of the rhino horn consumption that goes on in the world is in a couple of countries in Asia. So the cultural stereotypes are quite easy to form sometimes, and yet some of the best conservationists I get to work alongside are Vietnamese. It's as Jeff said, I think it's highly complex. And for an example, I won't go to Africa, actually, I'll go to Asia, where I've sat in villages that are within tiger territory and talked to them about getting along with the tigers. And people genuinely are proud of the tigers. And again, I'm generalizing about people. Not everybody in the village is a homogenous group, but there was a lot of support for, we love the tigers as an ideal, as part of our culture. We are proud of our tigers. And actually, as a reality, they're beautiful animals, and we'd be very upset if they weren't around. On the other hand, they come piling in and steal our goats, and we're really unhappy about that. And so, you know, and human wildlife conflict kicks off. It's the same with elephants in Thailand. And it is highly complex. As Jeff says, we all need to learn to live. If we're going to have 9-10 billion people on the planet and as much wildlife as we like, we're going to have to learn to live a lot closer together. But I think we've got to be very, very careful about stereotyping even smaller communities. When you get into cultures, it gets very complex indeed. So I'd be very careful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Josh or Simon, do you have anything to say on that? All good. Simon, all good?
With that, I mean, we're lucky with whale sharks anyway, and that things are mostly quite pro. And the cons of them, I guess, are stuff that we can actually leverage in conservation terms. So one of the cons, for instance, is like Josh was saying, like bycatch is a real issue to the mobulids, the devil rays and manta rays and things. And it's also a huge issue with whale sharks in terms of like them getting accidentally caught in, say, coastal gill nets that are fishing for other species that are tasty and more highly valuable, some of the pelagic fish and things. And whale sharks sometimes blunder their way into those nets, and they can cause a lot of damage to both the shark and the net. So being able to so that's a huge problem for the fishers, and the net is both their livelihood and a very expensive asset. So there was some amazing conservation work done over in India where they would actually deploy rangers to help free whale sharks, and they would like cut them out of the nets and things if necessary, and then reimburse the fishers for their net to remove that problem. But something we have been able to use in Mozambique a little bit is talking to the fishers. It's like, hey, do you ever catch whale sharks? And they'll be like, yeah, sometimes. It's a real pain. And because they don't want to, there's no real value in it for them at this stage, which is very fortunate. So that's something we can kind of use. Is go, hey, so our work is showing that most of the whale sharks travel up and down this corridor here. So if you can avoid that, then you can catch more of the fish you want, which are not at conservation issue, while avoiding some of these other species that use the same corridors, which also includes manta rays, often dolphins, great white sharks, and things like that as well. So yeah, it's not the same sort of issues in terms of conflict, but little bits here and there that are actually kind of beneficial for us. So easier.
Cool. It's good seeing how sort of scientific data can help with that sort of conflict as well, showing where those whale sharks are.
It's like, finally, we know something useful.
We can tell you one thing. Can't tell you where they differ.
Yeah. Don't ask us anything else.
All right. I think we'll come to one of our questions there. So we have a question from Ines, and it's kind of a pro and a con of this charismatic species popularity, tourism. So because people love these species, they want to go and see them, but this can sometimes have negative impacts. So Ines has said, tourism is an important way of working in conservation. However, it can also have a strong negative impact on several species. How can we use tourism and make it safe for the animals? So perhaps, Josh, we could come to you first with that one.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Tourism is often touted as, the solution to conservation issues, especially with these charismatic species. If you just introduce tourism, then all the fishing will stop, because obviously they're worth more in a tourism setting than they are in a fishing setting, which sometimes that math is true. And sort of before I get into the actual question, one really important thing that I don't think enough people are thinking hard enough about is that the user groups, the resource users and the people who benefit from those two different activities are usually completely different groups. It's not the fishermen who are suddenly going to take out tourists and see manta rays or whale sharks or polar bears or whatever it might be. And so often you start a tourism industry and some other group starts profiting off of the tourism, and the fishers are just completely left out of that equation. So there's not really that incentive for them to stop fishing and protect these animals. So that's something that we need to think more about before we even start thinking about the impacts of tourism. Just how do we make sure that tourism actually serves as an alternative to fishing? And there are some efforts out there that are trying to actually, educate fishermen and sort of ecotourism practices and get them working with tourists and things like that. But that's a really difficult transition oftentimes. And then in terms of over tourism or overuse in a tourism setting, I think we're also just starting to think about that now as we've moved away from some of the more acute issues. Obviously, targeted fisheries for manta and devil rays is worse than excessive tourism, right? There's no question about that. However, now that some of those targeted fisheries are becoming less prevalent and, we're starting to address these bycatch issues, we are seeing that really excessive tourism pressure can have negative impacts on especially manta populations, because those are really the ones that, that tourists go and see. And so I think, the first thing we need to do, and some people are doing this, is understand exactly what negative tourism pressure looks like. Is it just having too many people? Is it the way that you interact with these animals? And I have a student who's doing a really cool study in Mexico looking at that right now. And I think we need more research to create these sort of science-based best practices guidelines for interacting with these animals, because you know, we've already, some organizations, including Manta Trust, have started to put out these interaction guidelines for manta rays. And they're common sense things, you know, like don't chase after them, don't touch them, don't ride them, stuff like that. Obviously, that, you know, you don't want to do that. But there's probably more that we can do. And so having these sort of science-based guidelines are really important. And then also being able to demonstrate, this is a great example from my student, if you don't chase a manta ray, it both doesn't stress out the manta ray and you're more likely to have it hang around for longer. So everybody wins, right? So being able to demonstrate that kind of thing and really getting tourism operators on board with these low impact tourism opportunities and interactions, I think is crucial to sort of limit those impacts. And that's just going to be a matter of really working closely with tourism operators. A lot of outreach and education type stuff, I think is what people are already focusing on.
Okay, thank you very much. And Jeff, I guess it's a little different because I guess it's harder to go and see the polar bears, but do you have any issues or benefits from tourism? Or do you witness any?
Absolutely. And I'll start with the clear benefit that's already been touched on, is there is absolutely an aspect of seeing is believing, of bringing people to not just see a species necessarily, but to a place, and having them experience a very different habitat from the things that they normally see is transformational. It's transformational from an individual action sense. It's transformational from a donor sense. With corporate partners, it can inspire them to change how they do business sometimes. So there are some pretty big wins in connecting people to nature there. That being said, there's a whole complexity of issues that come along with it. Some that Josh touched on. One is local benefit. You know, are the people who are having to struggle in some cases to live with these cool species directly benefiting from tourism? I think the best example I've seen, and I'm sure there are faults to this as well, is when you go to visit the mountain gorillas in Rwanda. Small scale, highly regulated, direct local benefit, expensive. So it does exclude people economically in that sense, but it has a lot of other positive things going for it. With animals like a predator, like a polar bear, we do have to worry too about habituation. Are too many people getting too close to bears too often and teaching bears that that's okay? So then when a bear later on wanders into a community or a camp of mining engineers, oil and gas, research in the Arctic otherwise, will they just stroll on in? If they do that, they'll probably be killed. And so that's a real conservation negative there. And then I think the last one is just a bundle of potential negatives from carbon pollution. How much carbon are we spending to go to some of these places? And is that a good use of that carbon? To disturbance and general pollution in the Arctic, so much of tourism that has been growing is ship-based, and it's increasingly become larger and larger ships that are coming north. And you can imagine these 1,000+ person ships have their own wastewater issues, ballast water issues, along with, you know, the fossil fuel components that keep the ship running, that can all contaminate a rather pristine environment. So complex, and something I think, as Josh said, does in some places. Svalbard in the Arctic is a great example where tourism is heavily regulated by the Norwegian government. I think they're about to regulate it even further to make it smaller scale, to kind of push back against some of these large ships. That might be one positive from the current pandemic, is people might be less likely to want to jump on a large cruise ship anywhere anytime soon. So that might help us take care of the problem there too.
Okay, thank you. It's an interesting positive of the pandemic. John, what are your thoughts on tourism?
Well, I think the guys have spoken really well about the benefits of carefully managed tourism, and I completely agree with what they're saying. But when I think about tourism, I often, my brain goes immediately to African national parks, which are obviously incredibly well established and at many points, in many places, at capacity. And I think that highlights the thing that although there is absolutely a role for tourism to play, and as Josh says, you know, there's a lot of work in there about how to make it pay for local communities and beneficial, and there are lots of considerations about ecotourism. But ecotourism, sustainable tourism, by its very nature is limited. If it becomes too large a scale, it's no longer eco. And so I think it throws out a wider question. Yes, the role of tourism is important, and we can talk about what makes good sustainable tourism, but there's a much wider question of conservation requires finance. And I strongly believe that there's got to be a pretty rapid conversation about the value, why and how do we value the charismatic species that we're talking about? What is their value to us? Because in the previous century, the model was that people would pay to go and see them, which is fine if it's sustainable. They would pay to hunt them. They would, maybe that's to eat them. Maybe that's to display bits of them on a wall or on Instagram or on a mantelpiece somewhere, whatever. A lot of those models seem outdated in a world where we've lost 60% of our vertebrate abundance since I was a kid. So I would open it up and say, yeah, absolutely, there's a role for tourism. That role is by its own definition limited, whether it's carbon emissions or impact on the ground. So how else do we bring that support for conservation in a world where it's the second decade of the third decade of the 21st century? If anybody can answer that one, I'd love to hear it.
Anyone want to give it a crack? Yeah, I think you touched on something really interesting there with your mention of Instagram, because in the Maldives we see so many people now in the sort of Manta hotspot, and everyone's got their selfie sticks or their cameras, and they're trying to free dive to get pictures with the mantas, and a lot of people can't do it correctly, which is fine if you're not in the path of a manta ray. So it's tourism for selfies, and social media I think is becoming a huge issue. But then also social media is good because it helps people to share these animals, so it's a very complex issue. Simon, did you have anything you wanted to add to that sort of discussion point?
I'd love to be controversial here, but I completely agree with all of the points that have come up so far. I guess my main thing is just that if we are looking at tourism as a conservation tool, like it's covering ground that's already well tread, but there has to be a benefit to it has to be solving the conservation problem in some way, like so unsustainable fisheries or something. There has to be benefits coming back to that fishing community or those people that enable them to transition away from those practices. And secondly, if we're working on, if there's tourism on like endangered species, especially, I think there's a real a moral obligation to make sure the species is directly benefiting from that tourism. And there's, in whale sharks, the most controversial kind of tourism is in Oslo in the Philippines, where people are feeding the whale sharks to kind of keep them around. So there's guaranteed encounters. And I think there's about 500,000 people going there each year now. It's one of the biggest tourism attractions in the Philippines. And I mean, the economic impacts on that, on the local community, are completely undeniable. I mean, there's a huge amount of money coming in. It's all locally run and things, but I don't see it solving any conservation problems, really, because you've got any kind of problems that might have been solving at a smaller scale are then outweighed by just the mass tourism nature of it. But specifically, there's no real benefits going back to the species. So people often ask me actually, like, how can you tell, like how can they make their own personal choice about whether to support tourism? Because obviously a lot of people that think about this stuff are quite conflicted about tourism with their favorite animal sometimes, because they know there's gray areas and things. And I always say, it's like, have a look at the operator you're looking at and see if they are supporting research or like conservation efforts. And if they're not, maybe have a look around and see if there's any other operators there, because there has to be a benefit going back to those species.
Okay, great point. Thank you. Okay, so we've talked about a few of the pros and kind of touched on the cons as well. But I wanted to ask you guys if, sort of controversially, there's any issues you see with conserving these large species that we all work to conserve. Do you think that overall the benefit is greater by focusing on these species than if we focused on all the smaller species or the less charismatic species? What are your thoughts? Who should I come to first? Perhaps back to Josh. He's giving me a smile.
Oh, that's a tough one. I think that if anything, it's becoming clear that we just, as a global society, need to be putting many more resources into conservation overall. So I think that means that those species that are overlooked need more attention, as opposed to saying, you know, these charismatic species need less attention. I think that probably every species requires a lot more attention than it's currently getting, including a lot of these charismatic species. And I think that it is important for us to think about some of those other less charismatic, smaller species that have not historically received the sort of, public appreciation and public will to take conservation action and public funds. That's super important and definitely needs to increase. But I don't think that megafauna research or charismatic species research should then decrease to balance out. I think we need to sort of uplift all of them.
Definitely. And there's something you touched on earlier, Simon, with the ninja shark or whatever it was called. What's the name?
I think it was the ninja lantern shark, which I thought was genius.
So do you think that this sort of, I know you also work with sawfish, is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So do you think that
I help work with sawfish? Yeah.
Do you think we can sort of rebrand less charismatic animals into more charismatic animals for this purpose? Is that something that could be successful? Yeah,
it's really interesting. Like I'm not as immersed in the literature as I'd like to be, but it's something I want to dive into. There's kind of emerging academic literature on conservation marketing, which is using kind of behavioral change for conservation purposes. And a big part of that is things like names. And they find that there are, I'm kind of paraphrasing here because I'm not as deep in the literature as I'd like to be, but things like naming a species after a country, for instance, can create a lot more kind of perceived value of that species. Like over here in New Zealand, we've got the Maui's dolphin, which is one of the most endangered subspecies of marine mammal that's out there, and also Hector's dolphins, which are both, as a species, are endemic to New Zealand. And like Hector's dolphin's kind of meaningless, like it's named after, some guy. But so trying to rebrand it as like the New Zealand dolphin, to try and increase that perceived value, I guess. So yeah, I think names and stuff, like we are underestimating the value of that thing. And I've only read the abstract, but there was a paper I saw just the other day that was talking about the detrimental impact on some names when they call them like the lesser breasted, because like using names like lesser in that is giving a lower perceived value, and we need to be very, very careful of that. So yeah, I also just had some thoughts about what Josh said as well. And there's been this concept going around in the kind of academic conservation literature, which has been used by some governments as well, about triage based on the medical practices. Of course, like some people, I mean, grossly summarizing, but some species are so endangered and it costs so much money to bring them back to like a recovered state that it is not worth it. And we should be spending that money on the much broader number of species that are not so endangered, that we can make active interventions with and get them back to a kind of recovered state easier for a broader ecosystem benefit. And I think where that argument really falls down for me is the idea that there's a finite pot of money, because as we've already chatted about, like charismatic species can be used to leverage more money through fundraising and things, because we can inspire people that would like not otherwise be giving to conservation necessarily, like people that have named their companies after these animals or something like that. And we can achieve broader benefits as a result. I also think, on a political context, that triage is an excuse for governments to underfund conservation because they're just not putting enough money into it. And I think that's played out. Like one of the cases that they use is where triage has been applied is Australia, and Australia is not good at conservation. Like, I mean, they need to put more money into it. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that ecological triage is a very interesting concept. We had a question about it on a panel discussion the other day, and I got deep into a hole of researching it, and it's very controversial and complex, isn't it?
Mm.
All right, John, do you have anything you would like to add?
I think there are a few potential cons. Sometimes focus on a charismatic species can distract from the wider habitat. If you've got two charismatic species sharing the same area and they demand slightly different approaches, there can be conflict. People mutter about taxonomic inflation sometimes, where if you're dealing with charismatic species and you discover variations, it's more tempting to label one as a subspecies because then you can bring in more funding for that. But I think the pros dramatically outweigh the cons. And I think it is again, it is our channel for talking to the wider, particularly the wider public. We can get into, with scientific institutions and amongst ourselves, we can talk about large-scale marine parks, we can talk about landscape conservation on land, we can talk about all of these concepts, and maybe highly informed donors are open to those conversations. But when you're talking to the public, you're fundraising directly, which is important for conservation. An awful lot of conservation support comes straight from the general public. And also, of course, the general public influence politicians. And, Jeff will probably back me up on this one. If you want to explain about polar bears to the general public, you don't explain to them about climate impacts in the Arctic and the polar vortex breaking down and all of that. You show them a picture of a polar bear with a sore paw. And that's how you get your funding. So I think the pros dramatically outweigh the cons.
Okay, thank you. And I think, yeah, that leads us nicely onto Jeff, because polar bears perhaps symbolize the biggest threat there is, climate change or climate breakdown. So, I mean, it's hugely beneficial to use polar bears, although it's important to conserve them, obviously, in their own right. But what are your thoughts on this, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with what's been said for polar bears as well, and as other Arctic species. For us, one interesting con, because of the primary threat being climate change, is this concept of distancing the threat from people. So people look, they're concerned, they're like, oh, that's so sad that these polar bears are experiencing this, but that's far away. That's this exotic animal in a place I'll never be. It doesn't impact me. And so making that connection and saying, actually, it directly impacts you is a constant challenge. So it's a balancing act for us to just be aware of that distancing that occurs. It's just how our minds work, I think, as humans. And then I would say definitely on the cost side, working in the Arctic is one of the most expensive places to do research across species. So it does pull an inordinate amount of limited funding. And I would completely agree. I think funding for nature broadly is it's grossly underfunded and grossly undervalued, especially at the political level there. So it's something we need to see increase. And then I think too, with predators, with polar bears as a predator, we have some political cons there that touch on what I spoke on earlier, is remembering people live with these animals. But because they're political in a climate sense too, they become the target of climate denial as well. So we have this whole other aspect that has nothing to do with my work conserving the species, but because of today's politics, it becomes part of my work.
Okay, and what have you found works with connecting people to polar bears, to these distant animals and habitats? How do you do that?
With us, and I think this is a huge con of working with charismatic species, is the species itself does the initial connection. People make that. People had stuffed polar bears, stuffed whales, stuffed you name it, as children, and like others have said, the books, the movies, and so on, we deeply associate with these animals, which is curious because some of them are predators and will kill you. But we think of them in different aspects there. But then to take that story and bring it to a local example, in our case of climate, how that's impacting people in the Maldives, depending on your audience, bring it back to a local climate issue, a regional climate story that's something they might be able to see in their own backyards and say, oh yeah, that's happening here too. I should be concerned, not just for this interesting bear, but because it's impacting, the butterflies, the timing of, flowers forming and things like that here in my backyard in the UK.
Okay, thank you. And I think that brings us on to our last question before we go to the audience questions. So I wanted to ask you all, we've just done our audience poll, so I'm going to share it now. So we just asked about their experiences with animals they've seen in the wild, and what animal they would most like to see. And Josh looks very happy because manta ray won. Closely followed by whale shark and polar bear, and great white shark. So I wanted to ask about what are the big mysteries left to solve for these species, and what are the research priorities? And maybe Josh, you can talk to us first as the manta ray one.
Yeah, sure. I think that the two big priorities that I'm interested in with manta and devil rays are, number one, understanding how we can mitigate, reduce bycatch. It's much easier to address a targeted fishery. Not, simple, but it's you have a very defined target. Stop targeting manta rays, stop fishing these species. When it's, anytime you put a gill net or a purse seine or a long line in the water, you end up catching them. It's a way harder issue to tackle because we're not going to stop everybody from fishing. That's an unreasonable goal. So there's a lot of work that still remains to be done, looking at, number one, how can we avoid catching them in the first place? And that requires us to have a much better understanding of where they go, what sort of environmental characteristics are driving those movements and their distribution, so that we can say, hey, if you're, like sort of what Simon was saying, if you're going to go fish in that area, you're way more likely to catch a manta. So if you have other good options, maybe stay away from there. But then even with, best efforts, or in some cases, it's simply not possible to avoid catching them. Some of the work that I'm doing now is looking at what kind of handling and release practices will maximize their survival if you can get them off of your boat alive. And I think that is going to hopefully, again, mitigate bycatch even when we can't avoid it. And then one of the big ones is understanding what is happening to manta and devil ray populations. We have very little information on actual population trends. And so a lot of are the sort of presumed impacts of populations around the world are just our best guess. And that's usually that'll get you so far, but it's not good enough to sort of make really concrete conservation and management decisions.
Okay, thank you. I think over to you next, Simon. What are the big whale shark mysteries?
I'm kind of nodding away with Josh there. I led the last global conservation assessment for whale sharks back in 2016. And one of the problems we really faced with that assessment is we do not know how many of them there are. So the best information we had to try and find out whether the population was going up or increasing or decreasing was based on sightings at some of these places that are like tourism areas, these kind of coastal feeding areas where whale sharks do come together in numbers. And huge issue we face with that is, like, yes, we can monitor those places, but whale sharks swim around a lot and they are affected by environmental change. So it's just like, if there's less whale sharks, like, did they just go somewhere else? And we don't have an answer to that for the most point. But far larger than that, these places where we can monitor whale sharks, it tends to be almost all juvenile males. Sharks, which are like the least important part of the population in terms of actually helping them recover, because like we need to know where these larger juvenile females and small adults are, because those are the ones that have got kind of their entire breeding life ahead of them. And we don't know where these sharks are for the most point. And that means we cannot do effective conservation on them. So we're doing some really neat stuff in terms of research in places like the Galapagos Island, which is one of the only places we've found where we can reliably access like large females. We're starting to do some awesome stuff there with like underwater ultrasounds and being able to take blood samples from them when they're free swimming and that kind of thing. But we've got this huge kind of excuse me, John, but like elephant in the room here, and that we just don't know where most of the species lives. And we don't know how they're doing. So we really need to zero in on that stuff, like from a conservation perspective, just to check that the conservation efforts we are doing are actually working and that we are prioritizing resources appropriately.
And I read about those Galapagos whale sharks and the ultrasound, and how, it was probably you and your team, but you thought they were pregnant, but then the scans showed no sort of pups or anything. Did you ever find any signs of pregnancy? No
pups. We've got a manuscript in that's been submitted now. It's in revision. There's a couple of problems. It is super interesting work. Like, it's one of those like kind of reasons why I love science. It's like, right, with these giant whale sharks, and there's like the guys that Rui that does the ultrasounds. He's like this proper Japanese ninja diver that's got like a jetpack on his back and that kind of thing, waving the thing, and I'm taking photos. It's awesome. It's so fun. But whale sharks have got really thick skin, and it's really hard. Like, I mean, their skin, as we've found, is up to about sort of 25, 30 centimeters thick, even on the belly. And these are human ultrasounds we're trying to use that are just waterproofed for underwater use. And it's tough. So far, one of the things that's been most interesting for me is that we thought we were judging our perception on pregnancy predominantly, me personally anyway, on like having a really large kind of belly, like behind the pelvic fins, like behind the waist. And yeah, there are no organs there. Yep. So what we've actually found is that, I think, is that there's quite pronounced sexual dimorphism in whale sharks, which we were not expecting, and is not common to have a feature like that. But yeah, females, as they become adults, they develop this big bump, but it's not necessarily an indicator of pregnancy. And we can still do some awesome stuff with it, like over in St. Helena Island. Rui with his ultrasound was like monitoring their heartbeat and stuff to see how stressed they were in the wild versus captive ones, and getting the physiological stuff from blood sampling and things. Like, it's really moving the bar for us. But yeah, it does make me wonder, like, is anyone seeing pregnant whale sharks? Because I don't know if I've seen any now. So it's, yeah, definitely an interesting one for us to keep on to.
Yeah, it's amazing that these mysteries still exist, and it's so
so frustrating. People are like, what have you been doing for 15 years? I'm like, yeah. Stuff, okay, stuff.
Where did mantas give birth? We don't really know.
If you could rephrase that in the form of an answer, it'd be awesome.
Okay, John, maybe there aren't as huge mysteries for rhinos as there are for whale sharks or mantas, but
you'd think so. I was going to say, we don't have elephants in the room. We have pachyderms in the parlour. That way it could be a rhino. But I'll give you two. One of them is what the guys are talking about, is the lack of data. And I think people wouldn't be so surprised if you're talking about the vast oceans. They'd be more surprised with large terrestrial mammals. But still, a lot of the numbers that we come out with as conservationists should be suffixed with "we think," possibly, maybe, if we've counted right. So, in Indonesia, we're pretty sure that there are 72 Javan rhinos because we've got camera traps all over the place, and other people have, and they're picking up good data. The Sumatran rhinos on Sumatra are distributed in clumps of rainforest, and the numbers we've got are probably fewer than 80. They sometimes go down as few as 30. With error bars like that, they could even be higher as well. So there's still a lot of unknown there. You'll have heard of Sudan. It was the last of the male northern white rhinos, it's a subspecies, that died 2.5 years ago. So as far as we know, there are only 2 females left, and they're both infertile, and the last male's dead anyway. But again, that we know of. Other people have been out there and looked, so there's probably not any huge herds hanging around, but there may be some out there. Wouldn't that be lovely to find? So yeah, we don't know as much as we think we do. The other one is the big 21st century problem. Is the clash of, how do you deal with the clash of 20th or 19th century attitudes in the 21st century? And in our part of the world, it is 21st century consumption and production in a world where we've now got 7.5, nearly 8 billion people, and Jeff can tell you much better than I can what impact that's having in the Arctic. In East Asia, it is traditional medicine and a view of wildlife for consumption, for display, for status symbol, combined with 21st century population figures and high velocity rifles. And they just don't mix. How do we change human behavior? Whether it's stop wanting rhino horn in China and Vietnam, or for heaven's sake, switch to an electric car in the UK or the US. Getting the mass population on board is probably the biggest mystery of the 21st century. How do we bring people along?
Very big questions just to sort of finish us off. Maybe that'll take me nicely to you, Jeff.
Sure. So with us, I would say parking climate, there are really smart, really good people and organizations working on that. And I certainly hope we're successful collectively. And looking at just traditional wildlife issues with polar bears, surprisingly for such a charismatic and well-known species, we still struggle with basic issues like abundance and trends, especially looking at the entire Arctic population. If you look at polar bear status maps from the IUCN polar bear specialist groups, you'll see about half of the Arctic is still unknown. Most of that is in Russia. It's incredibly remote. It's super expensive. How do we fill those gaps? And we probably won't fill them with traditional wildlife research methods. We'll probably use new techniques, genetic techniques, remote sensing, potentially drones. Things I never thought would be useful in polar bear work may turn out to be. So there are tremendous opportunities for the next generations of scientists to significantly contribute there. But then it also trickles down to simple things like, what do polar bears smell? We don't know. That's useful, especially for a predator, both in terms of keeping them away, but are there scents they don't like that you could use as a deterrent, things like that? Or are there scents that they really like that you want to be careful with if you're in polar bear habitat? So there are a variety of questions that people might think that we must know by now with polar bears, but we don't. So definitely tremendous opportunities for younger scientists coming into the field.
Yeah. Okay. So really, we just need more funding everywhere, more researchers, more data. And that just brings us nicely onto, I'm just going to ask one question from the audience. And if you could just all give us quite a quick answer. Moed has asked, how can a young student enter these fields? Everyone is interested in sharks, for example. How do you break the barrier? And we've had this question over and over throughout these webinars. So what is your advice for somebody trying to break into these fields? Go back to you, Josh.
Learn statistics. That's going to set you apart from everybody else, and you'll get all the jobs. I mean, it's I'm saying it a little bit facetiously, but also in earnest, because as you have identified, Moed, there are so many people who are interested in working with these animals. Every undergraduate student, I mean, I'm sure all 4 of us must get dozens of emails every week from undergraduates who want to work on these animals, and how can I do that? And there just are not enough sort of assistantship positions for everybody, and also there's not enough funding to hire assistants, and I hate the idea of unpaid internships. I think that those are really problematic. So the way to sort of set yourself apart, I think, is to come prepared with skills that the other people at your career stage aren't going to have. And a big one is knowing how to operate the R programming language and do some basic statistics and data wrangling and things like that. And I think that's going to get you a really long way.
Okay. Thank you. Not the most like, I don't want to learn statistics that well, but yeah. Okay, Simon, what's your big advice?
Well, Josh isn't wrong. Getting a specialized kind of toolkit of skills is really useful if you're going to get into science. I would, this is like for a young student, like, okay, I mean, you know, like most of the time you're going to be, I think often just showing you're keen and interested and motivated goes such a long way. So for instance, if you do choose a university, if you want to study marine biology, which is definitely not the only way in, but if you were, then just like looking for grad students and things that could use some help with their projects, and showing up and being motivated and doing that kind of thing. And that's, I think, what often sets people apart is just that kind of ability to take in initiative. And like people, because there's so little money available in conservation, realistically, people often want to work with a known quantity. So if you are someone that comes recommended, or they've worked with yourself and they know you're good, then you'll have a huge leg up on that. And it is a small field as well. So people, like if people work for someone else that you know, you'll ask them how well they. But I think also Josh has touched on a really important point there, is that the thing of like volunteering, which is a bit of a rite of passage for especially kind of, call it Western students, is incredibly exclusionary, and there's all sorts of bias that goes on with that kind of thing as well, and it holds a lot of people out of these fields. So we've got to work on that. But one of the things, I actually had a conversation with a young shark researcher over here in New Zealand a couple of days ago, and one of the things I suggested to her to set yourself apart is to kind of like take the initiative and help and start to develop your own project, which is kind of what I did. Like there's so many people that will be applying for the same jobs and things, for instance, post-degree. But if you can kind of create your own job, for one thing, there's no one else to pay you, so sorry about that. But also no one can take it away from you. So I suggested to her like something that I did here in New Zealand when I got interested in sharks. I ended up going to Australia and then Mozambique and things, but like I was reading like fishing magazines and stuff and seeing who was doing catching sharks and stuff, and then like you'd be prepared to maybe go and have a chat to those fishers and see if there's anything interesting you could do there in terms of tagging them and stuff. Like so many people are looking to be given a project to work on, but there are comparatively so few people out there trying to develop a project that interests them, and it is far harder. Like there's no getting around that, and you've got to learn a lot more skills than marine biology to make it work, but it is definitely a way to create your own career.
That's a great way to stand apart from the crowd. John, what would your advice be for a young?
It's so difficult. It's heartbreaking that there are so many people trying to help and so few opportunities to do so. I mean, there's 9 of us, and one of those 9 is a paid internship, a revolving one that we run every year, just to give one more person a step up onto the ladder. Keep trying is the only thing. I mean, yes, if you can do something that sets apart, but I agree, the volunteering thing is incredibly discriminatory. So that's incredibly difficult. Keep trying. It was tough, 100 years ago when I was trying to get in there as well, and it didn't just fall. And I ended up selling televisions, and I ended up as a school teacher for a couple of years, and then you get the break. So if you come out of university and you've studied and you don't walk straight into a job in conservation, don't give up. Keep going at it, because you will get there.
Well, thank you. And what about you, Jeff?
I would say, conservation and wildlife research is changing rapidly right now, and we truly need everyone. We need a host of skills. It's not some of the simple tasks that we used to face, managing harvest, things like that. You know, so we need educators, we need communicators, we need engineers, we need mathematicians, we need teams of people to solve these complex problems. Social scientists, because as was mentioned before, so much of conservation revolves around humans, our actions or inactions. And so I would say, don't limit yourself to thinking there's only this one path to working on some of these species. There are actually multiple paths. And I'm working with engineers at university on radar detection projects. I'm working with engineers in corporate America to, you know, can we develop a better adhesive tag that sticks to fur and can stand Arctic temperatures and conditions? You know, and as Josh and Simon mentioned too, we work with modelers and mathematicians. One of my colleagues now, who's probably the predominant population modeler in the polar bear world, used to model oil fields for Amoco. He started a very different path, but those mathematical skills were directly applicable to wildlife problems. So I would say, keep your mind open, don't limit yourself. If an opportunity comes up to study crickets, maybe that's the pathway in to study tigers down the road. Like, our paths in this wildlife conservation arena tend to weave and wind. So don't give up.
Thank you. Very good advice. And the conservation world is very, very small. As everybody will know, everybody seems to know everybody. So making an impact on somebody usually has a good sort of reflection somewhere down the line. Okay, thank you so much to all of you for joining our panel and giving so many good insights, sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us, and having a few laughs as well. I've really learned a lot and enjoyed myself, so thank you very much.
Organizing, Flossie.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Excellent moderation.
Oh, thank you. It's my last one. So for the audience, thank you for watching. Thank you for some great questions. I'm sorry we didn't answer all of them, but hopefully you learned a lot as well. I'm sure you did. If you want to follow these amazing organizations, it's at Polar Bears International, Save the Rhino International, Marine Megafauna, Manta Trust, NOAA is NOAA. And do any of you have anything to add to those ones? All good. Yeah, so there you're going to see all the updates of the sort of research and work that all these amazing guys do, and their teams do as well. So as I said before, this is the final webinar. The recording will be up on the website within the next few days, along with all the other recordings. So we have a library now of all the webinars that you can watch and share with your family and friends. If you have any feedback, please do email us at info@mantatrust.org. We'd love to hear what you thought, any pros or cons of our webinar series, as we may repeat it in the future. We would love your support with some of our projects. So there's some ways you can support the Manta Trust. You can donate to our emergency fund. So a lot of our affiliate projects are struggling right now with the pandemic, and any donations you give will go directly to supporting them to get through this pandemic and continue their research and conservation. You can find that on our webinars page. So that's mantatrust.org/webinars. And if you scroll down, you can find that emergency appeal. You can also sign up to the Cyclone or Adopt a Manta. So these are really cool things where you pay a little bit of money, it goes into manta conservation. And as we've seen, manta conservation goes further than just mantas, and you get something really cool in return. So we appreciate any support that you can give us, and I'm sure the same goes for all of the organizations that these guys work with or work for. All right, that's it from me. So thanks again, guys. Have a great morning, Simon, evening, John, and afternoon, Josh and Jeff, I think. And it's good night from me. So thank you again.
Thanks very much, Flossie, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Bye,
Thank you, everybody.